Okay, good morning. Please take your seats. We're going to open the conference. Sabah al-khair. Okay, good morning. My name is Nasser Yassin. I'm a faculty member in the School of Public Health in AUB, and I'm the Director of Research in the Sam Faris Institute for Public Policy. And I've been working with my colleagues at IFI, at AUB for Refugees Initiative, and at LSE and ALUM Network to organize this conference. So we're really so glad to have you with us today and for the next, for today and for tomorrow. We were expecting His Excellency, the Minister of Education and Higher Education, but you know, we're in a dynamic region, so the country slept on Friday evening different than what it actually woke up on Friday morning. So, but we have my friend MP Ziad Qadri. Thanks for coming. We have ambassadors, Madame Girard, the Unhcr representative, and Mr. Provost, Mr. Mohammed Harajli. Thank you for coming, and thanks for everyone, for the guests and for our colleagues. This is a conference that's part of the ALUM network. Eric Bergloff, the director of the Institute for Global Affairs at LSE, will tell us more about the network, but AUB joined the network last year, and this is the Alliance of Lead Universities on Migration. Until last year, it was mostly a European club, so we actually engaged with Eric and Piroska and the colleagues, and we tried to convince them that this is where the refugee issues are happening, more than in Europe. Europe only has, I guess, a small percent of its population is refugees, whereas actually the region here, and Syria in particular, are going through this crisis or this protracted crisis. We want to thank the Open Society Foundation for helping us in making this conference and for supporting ALUM. And I want to thank also the Unhcr office here in Beirut for supporting in this conference. It will be for 2 days. We have 5 sessions. They look into issues related to the refugee crisis and the refugee question, but also into how universities are responding. And we have 2 roundtables, and in those roundtables, we'll particularly try to ask questions about our role as academics, as academy, in responding to policy issues, to advocacy issues, to impacting more the debate on the refugees and immigration. We have another roundtable tomorrow related to the business schools and to the private sector and how businesses are actually or can contribute to addressing impacts of the refugee crisis. And we have 3 keynotes that will be addressed and introduced throughout. We're using the hashtag AUB for Refugees. Last year we did trend. I doubt we will trend today with what's happening in the government, so we can't compete with what's going on. But I want to give you in 1 minute why we're actually here in this forum, why we're here. You know, I think this is an age of growing uncertainty. It's an age where actually a constant anxiety exists, and such anxieties and uncertainties are being fueled by populists, by demagogue politicians, reinforcing actually such anxiety and replaying the game of xenophobia against refugees, against immigrants. And it's our natural role as universities to assure societies, to assure our communities, and actually stand with those most vulnerable and disenfranchised. I think when we stand with refugees, it's not just we're doing the research to impact the discussion only. We're not just doing research to prove or to do assessment. Actually, at the essence of it is to stand with those who need to be stand, as universities should do, you know, whether refugees or poor host communities. So that's actually one of the premises of this conference and the whole discussion and the whole of work of the ALUM and what we do here in AUB. But also in the age of post-facts, you know, it's a post-fact society, falsehood, fake news. I mean, you get to read about this every day. And such fake news and falsehoods are exaggerating the burdens. It's our role as universities to actually address this in what we do best, research and evidence, in facts. Really bring the debate back where it should be, based on the evidence. That's our role, you know. So we really need to get this back. I mean, academics, as usually in their ivory tower, shouldn't be the case. We should actually really work on those issues and bring the debate back to evidence and facts. That's the best we can do. And thirdly, this is really an age of increasing gatedness. We're gated as communities, we gated as societies, physically, socially, politically, academically. I think we need to, what we do in such forum and through these networks is really to break such gates and such rules. And we ought as universities to be open and safe spaces, as universities should be, you know, and as an enlightened places where we need to debate and open those issues in a safe space, such a university, such an institute, such a forum like this. And that's exactly what we want to do here in this debate. Open the discussion in a very, you know, positive and open manner, and there are no taboos around the issues. We need to put all these things on the discussion. And that's exactly what we aim to do on this forum. I don't want to, it's not a speech, I just want to put the context and the scene we are in, where actually we can move forward in the discussion and in the sessions. And I'll stop here and I'll ask my colleague, Eric Bergloff, to also say a few words about it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay. No. So thank you, Nasser, and it's been wonderful to work with you on this, preparing this conference. So I really want to greet you welcome on behalf of the Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE and the Alliance of Leading Universities on Migration, or ALUM as we call it. So it's great to be back in Beirut and back at AUB. It's great to be back at this campus that I think is the most beautiful campus in the world, actually. And so we are coming together here, you know, across countries, across regions, across disciplines. We are bringing in perspectives of policymakers, of businesses. It's really an experiment. It's not a very controlled experiment, but it's nevertheless an experiment. And we want to experiment in generating ideas for how universities can respond to the refugee crisis. It's, you know, last time I was here in Beirut, it was for the launch of the AUB for Refugees initiative. And we were so deeply impressed by the scale and scope of what different departments and individual faculty and students have done to reach out and open up to the refugee community in Lebanon. So indeed it inspired us at LSE to start working with AUB on a vision that we call Universities Without Borders. It may be a bit cliche, but I will try to give you a sense of what we have in mind. It's a vision where universities not only open up, you know, to provide scholarships to refugees or maybe provide safe harbor to scholars at risk, but it's really, as Nasser so elegantly showed, it's about opening up these gated communities of disciplines and also of different categories of staff in universities. We really think that migration can and working with refugees can create an energy that can break down these borders and open up conversations and also inspire action in a way that very few other issues can. And of course, ultimately, it's about trying to play a role in the protection and integration of refugees and in managing the refugee crisis. But of course, this is not only taking place at AUB. When we were calling around in the fall of 2015 to universities across Europe, we were really struck by how much was happening, more or less spontaneously, in universities across Europe. And, you know, very spontaneous initiatives. I remember when we were speaking to Mannheim, for example, you know, they have given up a number of lecture halls to house refugees. They had, your students have started collecting used bikes for refugees. It was a lot of spontaneous action, and I think what makes universities different is, of course, many of the things that Nasser was emphasizing about the openness and so on, but it's also, you know, what we are good at is to learn from what we are doing. At least we claim to be good at this, and that's what we wanted to develop within this initiative. So not only do we want to be activists and be out there and try to have an impact, but we also want to learn about how to best to do this. So we want to combine activism and research, what we call activist research. And this is very much the spirit of the ALUM network, but it's also the spirit of this Universities Without Borders. And so Universities Without Borders is about opening up universities to the rest of the community, but also about tearing down these walls within universities across disciplines. And it's probably not even economics will claim that they have all the answers to the migration challenge. But from our experience, the refugee issue is an issue that can also break down barriers across categories of staff and between faculty and students. We want to use, again, the power of migration to engage and inspire. And from what I've seen here with the AUB for refugees, it's a beautiful illustration of power. So we are very much committed to playing a role in shaping policy and helping implementation on the ground. And of course, an important part of this is influencing attitudes and behavior. Again, AUB with its facts on daily facts on the refugee crisis has played a very important role in highlighting this and getting a lot of attention to these facts. But we also try to engage other universities in this region, and again, AUB has been central to help us do this. We want to encourage high-quality research and evidence-based policymaking, but we also want to engage with civil society and the private sector. We think that universities can play a role in helping to build capacity also in non-governmental organizations that often struggle, particularly local organizations, without these global networks. We can play a role in supporting that. And we will very much want to do this in a partnership with AUB. So we are developing this initiative together with the Open Society Foundation, and we're very grateful for their support for this conference. But maybe most of all, we are very grateful to Professor Nasser and his team here, Roya Kodor and her colleagues, have done so much to make this event happen. And I'm also very grateful to my own team here, Piroska and Noj Mohaji and Jerry Mirich and Karina Stern for all their hard work. So thank you very much and most welcome to this conference. Thank you.
Mr. Provost, Dr. Mohammed Harajli is the Provost of AUB, and he will, now the floor is for Dr. Harajli, where he'll tell us about AUB and what AUB is doing on the refugee scene, please.
Thank you, Nasser. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Fellow organizers, esteemed guests, AUB officials, and friends, good morning again. On behalf of AUB, I would like to welcome you on our Beirut campus. AUB is a university that for the past 151 years had thrived amidst repeatedly emerging instabilities in the region. And the last one was the resignation of our Prime Minister in Lebanon. It is no secret that this region of the world did not witness a stretched period of good times in the near history. Yet, despite all, AUB has managed to educate the best intellectuals, statesmen, scientists, engineers, and doctors of the Arab world. Our graduates live up to our motto, engaged on our main gate, that they may have life and have it more abundantly. At AUB, we are not looking just to give our graduates a better life. However, we are equipping them to make the world a better place. Through service and for years, we have strived to give a better life to the entire community, impacting the lives of the most vulnerable members of our societies. In fact, it's our duty as a world-class university in the heart of Beirut to serve the underprivileged to the limits of our ability. Through the years, we have faced, unfortunately, many refugee crises, as far as the first waves of Armenian refugees arriving in Beirut in 1915 and 1939, then Palestinians in 1948. The Lebanese internally displaced in the 1970s and 1980s because of the civil war and because of the war against Lebanon, and most recently, Syrian refugees. AUB, through its faculty, its medical center, and its students, never shied away from assisting and serving its community. However, today we are facing the hardest challenge of all times. The current refugee crisis is a scale never seen since World War II. And it has created unprecedented challenges for refugees themselves and for the hosting communities. Competition over the scarce resources and an increased pressure on the educational and health services, among others, have led the systems running these sectors to reach their limits. Our position as a university in responding to such a crisis is not that of academic luxury, but it is an utmost necessity. At AUB, we have adopted a whole university approach to address the impacts of the refugee crisis. Through the AUB for Refugees initiative, led by Mr. Nasser Yassin and colleagues, we have mapped 72 projects from across all units in AUB, from medicine, health sciences, agriculture, engineering, to social sciences, humanities, public policy, civic engagement, and community education. Through research, teaching, or community engagement, all of these projects aim to innovate, to be innovative, and to generate cutting-edge and feasible results. We also understand that young refugees, men and women, as well as those bright kids in the impoverished host communities, are struggling to get the proper education. Believing that those young women and men will be the future of their countries, we have launched and continue to expand several of our educational programs to provide for those vulnerable societies a chance for a better future for them and for societies they live in or they will eventually serve in the future. As part of the AUB for Refugees initiative, AUB, and in collaboration with the Kayani Foundation, led by Mrs. Noura Jumblat, took the initiative to bring education to the temporary settlements of the Syrian refugees. In collaboration and partnership with Kayani, 9 Ghata schools are welcoming more than 4,500 refugees have been established in the Bekaa plain, in the Bekaa region, offering primary education, vocational training, and university preparatory education. The Ghata project was first developed to address the urgent need for a safe and temporary shelter for Syrian refugees living in informal tented settlements throughout Lebanon. Ghata structures are designed by our own Center for Civic Engagement and Community Service as a cost-effective units built from locally available materials, simple to assemble, disassemble, and transport, and capable of withstanding difficult weather conditions. 62 units were installed in the refugees camps in Bekaa, serving as classrooms to which the young children have easy access to. A few months ago, President Khouri and I, the president of AUB, President Khouri and I, had the chance to visit these schools with Mrs. Noura Jumblat, and I was overwhelmed by the cheerful faces and the enthusiasm for learning of these young children. The children aged 5 to 16 are very young. These schools represent an oasis of hope in a desert, as I put it one day. These schools represent an oasis of hope in a desert of indifference by the international community towards one of the most agonizing refugee crises that the world has ever witnessed. We want to continue to fulfill AUB's mission and to present those communities with opportunities for higher education. Through our scholarship programs, we are able to provide the financially needy but bright students with education at AUB that they deserve. It is a priority for AUB to further expand those programs and open the gates for more students to join. We want to make sure that any member of the refugee community, regardless of their financial status, is able to enter AUB. Our graduates' positive impact echoes for years within their societies. Hence, we believe that education is the best investment for the betterment of humanity and society, and particularly in this part of the world. The roles of universities is crucial at this point. We see this international conference as a great opportunity to widen the debate on how universities can respond to the refugee crises. Let me remind you that the world today has more than 65 million refugees. This figure is correct? Is it? It is. The highest to be recorded. The discussion you will have in this room shall be heard by all of those concerned in resolving the predicaments of refugees. It's a great pleasure to welcome you today and to know that scholars from 21 universities from across the world are present here today. I wish you a good time at AUB and a very successful and a productive conference. I will look forward to read its declaration, the Beirut Declaration. Thank you and have a great morning.
Thank you, Mr. Provost. The morning, we didn't mention that we're actually working on what we call the Beirut Declaration. Thank you, Mr. Provost, for reminding us about this. The Beirut Declaration with, yes, with the teams in ALUM, with AUB and LSE, we actually came up with this idea to do what we call the Beirut Declaration of how the universities and academics can and should and need to respond to crises like the refugee crisis and the migration crisis in Europe. So we want to set the stage for how universities should work on this. So hopefully tomorrow we'll be working on drafting this. So anyone is welcome at 8 a.m. if you would like to come to join the small team that's actually drafting it, and we will announce its final draft before we close tomorrow afternoon. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Mireille Girard, the representative of Unhcr in Lebanon, and I think she will confirm the 65 million refugees at the well. Please.
Thank you very much. On the 65 million, it's actually 65 million persons displaced by war and other circumstances. 22 million of them are refugees. The others are displaced inside their countries. But an equal level of suffering, I would say. So I wanted to thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a privilege to be here, and we're all very much looking forward to the content of the Beirut Declaration tomorrow. I mean, clearly for UNHCR as a practitioner agency, if you wish, the role of university all over the world, and clearly here in Lebanon, universities of Lebanon have always played a very critical role in the advancing of policies and the development of the doctrine when it comes to law, for example. So these are very critical contribution to crisis in the world, to response to crisis in the world, and this role is not going to end. If anything, it will take more magnitude as we move forward. Here, perhaps for the purpose of this conference, I would like to quickly point to perhaps 3 areas of strategic alliances where the humanitarian world and universities can really join forces to push the agenda for the protection of people in crisis. So first and foremost, I would say university can be really a voice in the global debate on refugee protection, on migration, on issues relating to displacement. As you know, we had last year in New York a conference on refugees and migrants that led to a New York Declaration. So let's see how the Beirut Declaration contributes to the New York Declaration. That created the frame of a comprehensive refugee response framework, explaining how a refugee problem is everyone's problem. It's not one country's problem. And we can all contribute from the beginning of the crisis to the end of it, from the first days of being uprooted to a final solution to a refugee crisis. How we can all contribute. You were speaking about the whole of university approach. I will say the New York Declaration speaks about the whole of society response, how everyone from religious institution, civil society in general, political circles, people themselves, the private sector. Tomorrow you're going to look into more the private sector contribution. This is a very much untapped resources in refugee crisis. We have a lot to learn from this. So in the context of this whole of society response, universities have a fundamental role to play. They have played that in the past, but perhaps now with in this context of preparing for the next conference in New York, September next year, or the fall of next year, where a global refugee compact will be adopted. So beyond just a framework, we will be working towards, we have 1 year to go, to work towards a global agreement on refugee responsibility sharing for refugee response. So we have a year to go. This is a challenging task. What can we contribute? And what can AUB, what can the universities in Lebanon, what can universities in the world contribute to that? I think this is a challenge ahead of us that we shouldn't let go. Collecting good practices, experimentation, policy, guidance, everything that we can contribute to the Global Compact. The second avenue of strategic alliance could be certainly universities as a melting pot for innovation. We've discussed that with the creation of AUB for refugees. Actually, we had that discussion, how universities are at the forefront of research, of experimentation, of innovation. How can we think more and better and less expensive? What can we do better in the context of a humanitarian response? In the context of the Grand Bargain, you know, the World Humanitarian Summit that took place last year as well, and the Grand Bargain theory that, you know, we all have to really push the parameters of efficiency, of relevance, of usefulness for people. What can university contribute to this? Here in Beirut, for example, we're working with AUB on targeting. How can we target the most vulnerable people out of the 1 million plus refugees here in this country? How can we really, if we don't have money for everyone, how can we find the most vulnerable? Through not only going and visiting everyone, but science can help us jump the gun and actually find the people through a desk formula that enables us to immediately, before even visiting people, we can identify them. That's one of the research we do. With Saint Joseph University, we're working with the School of Social Sciences to also work in terms of working more closely with population. How can we empower populations to help themselves first? And so these are a few avenues that I wanted to mention. And lastly, with universities, another avenue for cooperation and strategic alliance is universities as social moderators. I think everyone spoke about it today. It is a topical issue. University in a context where there is a restriction there is a debate that is sometimes very heated, restrictions on discussions on the rights of refugees. A university can advocate for rights, can stand for rights, reminding everyone that at the end we're speaking about people. We are speaking about human beings. Having the distance that university have to speak with an authoritative voice and remind everyone to the basics. Combat fears with facts, and this is what AUB for Refugees is doing, with instilling facts. You know, the debate sometimes can be inflamed based on figures that actually are generating fear, incitation to violence, whereas they're not actually grounded on reality. By really injecting facts in the debate, we are actually moderating the debate. We are calming down a situation that could be very heated otherwise. So at this crucial moment here in Lebanon, but elsewhere in the world, I would say in Europe, clearly, in other parts of where we have other crises, in Kenya, for example, other parts of the world, Asia, the Rohingyas, you know, university can help us put us back to the basics, as I said. We're working with Saint Joseph University, for example, also on perception survey. How do the Lebanese community feel about, how does it feel about refugee presence, and how do the refugee feel about being hosted here in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Turkey? What is the feelings? And, you know, analyzing that so that we can better respond to the anxiety sometimes of people on all sides. And finally, universities are also an opportunity for refugees and other displaced population to study, to have a future. Here in AUB, I know you have a number of students of scholarship that you're sponsoring. Unhcr in this country has several hundred students that are benefiting from a scholarship that enables them to pursue their tertiary education, even though they had to interrupt it when they fled their country. So universities are also have also that role of providing a space to study, a space to not lose their future, and creating a generation of hope for their country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Girard. So now we'll move to the keynote speech, the first keynote speech, and my colleague Piroshka from LSE will introduce our first keynote speaker. Piroshka.
Good morning, everyone. I am Piroshka Nagy-Mohácsi. I work with Eric Berglov, whom you have already heard in LSE at the Institute for Global Affairs, and very closely now, I'm proud to say, with Nasser and his wonderful team on the migration area. It is my absolute distinct privilege to introduce you to the keynote speaker of today. He's coming from my neck of the wood, Central Europe, and has had an incredible career behind him. And he is now with us, with LSE at the Institute, so there is still, we look forward to a lot of new and big things to be done together with Professor Marek Baraka. Professor Marek Baraka is a unique band of academic research. He's published in the area of macro policy, monetary policy, inflation targeting. But maybe he's even better known for his political leadership, policy making in his home country, Poland, and regionally in Europe, as well as at the global level. Poland, as you know, is today one of the largest, most important European country. It was not the case until the fall of the Berlin Wall, until the changeover, political changeover that the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed to happen. Poland was a poor, underdeveloped, or misdeveloped country rather, and Professor Baraka was a key architect of Poland's economic and political transformation from the beginning, from the 1990s. And that has really brought Poland from one of the laggard of Europe into one of the leaders of today's European Union. Poland is now, I just checked, among the 15 biggest economies in the world as a result partly of his efforts. His actually work in the transformation has been tested by the global financial crisis and how Poland reacted and managed that. Poland was the only country in Europe which did not suffer from a deep recession, and that was really to the credit of the very skillful transformation, which was politically and socially minded transformation that Professor Marek Baraka has been part of. But he didn't stop in Poland. He has been a major architect of the European transformation. He played a founding role, for example, in the European Risk Stability Forum when the ECB was taking up further and Europe further systemic responsibilities. He was the director of the European department of the IMF at a critical juncture, just when the global financial crisis hit Europe, both emerging Europe from his originally and advanced Europe as well. And he was a leader in the thought process and innovative approach that the IMF finally took on to address the global financial crisis in the European context. Closer to home, we know him also, Eric and I, as the chairman of the Vienna Initiative, which is probably not that well known here, but has been critical in handling the European financial crisis in a cooperative, cross-border cooperative, multi-stakeholder fashion. He's popular, very much liked, and he is bringing a very unique aspect today to the discussion. the perspective of Europe and European politics and how it reflects, how it has reflected Europe when the Syrian refugee crisis had started, and how Europe has transformed, and perhaps some insights of how a collaborative and politically minded but still ambitious plan can be put together to manage the refugee crisis. Professor Marek Baraka, please take the floor.
Well, thank you for your kind words, but the real recommendation for me to talk to you here is that I am a friend of Eric Berkloff and Piros Kanoj. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Well, there is another reason why I agreed to come 43 years ago when I was a student. I took a rather adventurous trip to this region with a friend of mine. You can imagine how impossible and difficult it was for two young people from behind the Iron Curtain. And on this trip I visited also Beirut, and the only thing really I remember from Beirut of 1974 was the campus of this university, where I was staying at a youth hostel in summer months. So when I got the invitation, I couldn't resist. So here I am. I'm not going to talk about Poland, about the region of Central and Eastern Europe, but I'll try to offer you some remarks on how Europe and the European polity, the European electorates, the European societies look at refugee crisis, which is now one of the constituting factors of European political landscape. Of course, people were attracted to Europe many years or many centuries ago, many years ago. In the after-war period, people drew to Europe because it was attractive from economic point of view, from social point of view, but also political developments prompted people to come to Europe from the collapsed colonial empires of France or Britain. So people from other parts of the world are not unusual for Europeans. They have always been there, and it looked for decades that the whole process was mutually advantageous or smoothly mutually advantageous. Europe needed people because of its demographics. The people needed Europe to better their livelihoods, to come back to where their homes or their perceived homes were, like the Pieds Noirs from Northern Africa. So what really happened recently that made the refugee crisis so different, so devastating politically and socially? One of my colleagues, a very interesting political analyst from Bulgaria, Ivan Krastev, you may have heard about him, he formulated something like a thesis, something like this, that the recent refugee crisis for Europe is similar in its impact to the 9/11 attack on World Trade Center in America. It changed politics. It changed the mood. Let's think about how it changed, how it could have changed, and what is the reaction of Europe to this? Well, first, what made this last wave of immigration different from others? I think there are many reasons, but let me mention three. Well, first, it's numbers. The numbers were bigger than before, than for many decades. Well, let's just realize that almost 2 million people came to Germany in 2 years, 2015 and 16. Germany is the biggest country and the biggest destination for refugees. But all in all, the whole Europe acquired or welcomed millions of refugees in the last 2-3 years. Well, why? Of course, we know it's the developments in Syria, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, many other developments in those regions of the world. Second, and this is something that you probably, it's obvious, it's a platitude, but let me mention it. It's the fear from terrorism. For the first time in my lifetime, as far as I remember, immigration was associated in a popular way with terrorism. Well, the successes, infamous successes of ISIS triggered this way of thinking and associating foreigners, refugees with terror. Even it was completely misleading. It was wrong. Most terrorists in France are the third generation people excluded from the French societies, and the same goes for the UK. But you don't need refugees to be afraid of them. In my country, there are no refugees. We have like 1 million Ukrainians, but they are seasonal workers and culturally so similar to us Poles that it's undistinguishable. And after 1 year, they speak Polish fluently. But still, the fear of refugees can be artificially produced by right-wing populists. Let me make a short statement on this. Populism has always been with us, but traditionally populists were the left-wing populists, okay? Anti-capitalist populists. So them, capitalists, us, workers, proletariat. Well, myself being probably left-leaning, but still mainstream economist, don't expect that I'm an enthusiast of left-wing populists. However, I'm sort of realistic enough to know that economists are now much more humble, much less imperialistic in their view of the world to recognize that there are grounds for left-wing populism. However, in the recent years, we observe another kind of populism emerging, which is the right-wing populism. The right-wing populism still has this us and them, capital labor dimension, but there is another, more vitriolic one, more vitriolic dimension, which is the aliens, us, people from our society, and them aliens. The right-wing populism is something that, well, smells on racism, even. And it is on the rise, or at least it has been very much on the rise in Europe. Well, not only in Europe, of course. Look at the United States and the President Trump. He is certainly not a left-wing populist. But the right-wing? Yes. So the impact of the last wave of refugees, the numbers, the terrorist threat, created created a prolific soil for right-wing populism. There is another factor, another reason of why the recent wave of refugees was different in the minds and in the perceptions of Europeans. It's the aftermath of the crisis. It's the aftermath of the crisis. It's not only the big financial crisis of 2008, but it's the long-run effect of globalization and technology on advanced economies. A loss of jobs is one of the consequences of those. And when you are uncertain about your economic future, when you are afraid of terrorist attacks, well, you can be exploited by certain politicians to become xenophobic, nativist, inward-looking, hostile to aliens. Well, so what did it change in the European political landscape? As I have already alluded to, right-wing populists entered the scene. Let's start chronologically as the situation evolved in the last a year and a half. Netherlands, you remember Kim Wilders and his anti-immigration stance. Marine Le Pen in France. But also, I think that Brexit was a result of this. Not so much the fear from Muslim immigration, but it's more about the Poles and the Romanians. So we have different layers, different dimensions of this threat, of this fear of immigration. Of course, what we are observing in Central Europe is another part of this drama. Countries here turn to illiberal democracy, turn xenophobic, even if they have no refugees, 0 refugees. My country is a very good example of this. We haven't agreed to any kind of sharing arrangement within the European Union, even if this would be of 0 effect on the Polish population. But you don't need refugees to be afraid of refugees. Well, even more so. About 15 years ago, Poland accepted about 70,000 of Chechens after the second Chechen war, so early Putin war, so to say. Well, the Chechens are known to be quite extreme Islamists, or at least there are some of them among them. There was no problem for us in the year 2001, 2002 to accept 70,000 of them. Maybe because they were enemies of Russia. If the enemies of our enemies, well, they must be friends. I mean, of course, it's a bitter irony on my side rather than a description of the situation. But there was no fear. And we don't have even one example of a terrorist incident coming from this side. Now we have no refugees at all, but 60% of the people, even those who don't vote for the current very inward-looking government, are against accepting refugees. So this is a clinical example of how you can manipulate people into xenophobia. Well, so is this a hopeless situation for Europe? Are we going to slide into right-wing populism? Are we going to desert our beloved notion that Europe is a community of values, human rights, openness? Don't treat it with cynicism. We really think we are open, helping. Let me joke a little bit. Much better than Americans, okay? Which is probably not true, but this is what Europeans like to think of themselves. Is this going to be lost? Well, I think that we have to be very pragmatic here, and there are already certain tendencies in the European politics, in the European social development that can stop this dangerous tendency. What is this? Well, if you believe in democracy, you have to look what the people think. I mean, the worst strategy would be to say, no, the people are stupid. Let's ignore right-wing populism or populism at large. Let them, come to their own mind. We have the high moral ground. There are certain political parties in Europe who act in the following way, and they lose dramatically. If we follow this route, we put at risk the whole European project. What is then the way out for democratic society? Well, you have to look seriously at what the people think, at what the people are afraid of, and try to mitigate those threats. Adapt some of these fears into your program. Tame them, well, domesticate them. And this is what is happening. Mark Rutte was probably the first leader of a West European country who sort of stole some of the ideas, some of the pronouncements, let's put it this way, of Kim Wilders. He told the people in the Netherlands, okay, I'll take care of this, but in a better way, in a more civilized way. Don't trust this lunatic, far-right lunatic. And many people believed him. He was re-elected. Well, we can go the Macron way or the Kurz way. Well, Kurz is probably prematurely. Kurz is the new election winner in Austria, who will probably become the youngest West European prime minister, 30 years old, 4 years after he assumed office of foreign minister. So he's a very experienced politician. So he has immediately been labeled as a far right, as a manifestation of the country going right to the wall of right-wingery. That's probably premature or not true. Macron, although he was part of the French establishment, he portrayed himself as a new phenomenon. What he says about, he abandoned the refugee issue as the main issue, but what he says is very definitive. I'm against illegal immigration, whatever it means. Kurz, the Austrian case, he chose immigration or refugees as the main election issue. But this does not mean that his position is very different from that of Macron. Well, of course, it's very difficult for a European to first unify their asylum policy, to invest in the protection of borders. Protection of borders is a tricky issue, because on the one hand, the people want it, and we have to do it. On the other, there will be opinions. We don't want Europe to be transformed into a fortress. So, how to balance these two issues? This is not entirely best news for Lebanon, but I think that the worst news for the Europeans would be to let the whole project of European integration to collapse because of radical change of mood of the population. I think that it's much better to make a small step back, put some order into the let's say, external border policy of Europe, spend more money where it is spent in a smartest way, and still retain Europe as a region where human rights, openness survives. Is this in the best interest of Beirut, American University in Beirut, the people of Syria? I don't know. It's up to you to decide. I don't have solutions. But this is how I perceive the European mood to develop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was an eye-opener, and definitely will take many of the ideas in the discussion in the next 2 days in the panels and the roundtables. Now we'll take 15 minutes of break. We won't have time because we started a bit late, but you're free to talk to Professor Welken now in the break. So 15 minutes of coffee break, and then we'll be back to the first of the sessions. Thank you.